And I'll be back with a full bulletin of world news for you at 3 o'clock. Well, now, in a change to our programming on News 24, it's Straight Talk with Jenny Scott.
Hello, welcome to Straight Talk. There's not been much sign of the festive spirit here at Westminster this week. The Liberal Democrats have been plotting to overthrow their leader. Labour MPs don't want to be in the Prime Minister's gang when it comes to school reforms. And the new Tory leader tells his party to get a new face or else. Well, with me for some more Straight Talk are George Jones of the Daily Telegraph, John Rentoul of the Independent on Sunday, and Anne Alexander of the Yorkshire Evening Post. We'll hear from them in just a moment. But first, just 7 months ago, Charles Kennedy led the Liberal Democrats to their best ever election performance. But that must seem like a distant memory now as he struggles to survive as leader. This week he faced an attempted coup and his deputy, Sir Min Campbell, initially declined to back him. Mr Kennedy says he has no intention of resigning. But how much longer will he last? Our political editor, Nick Robinson, reports.
Charles Kennedy!
One question hung over the Commons today. Will this be the last time Charles Kennedy appears as leader of the Lib Dems at question time?
Mr Speaker, last week...
Behind you, they shouted, aware that some of his MPs today went to see him to tell him to go. Tonight in his office, he tried to shrug off what he called grumbles and complaints.
You've been talking to your MPs. How many actually said to your face they thought you should go?
There was not any sense whatsoever, and it was reflected at the meeting, that there was any question about my leadership position at all.
No one said to your face, the best thing you can do for the party is to go?
Nobody was looking at all, in terms of the contributions in our private discussions as well as in the course of the wider parliamentary meeting tonight, any need or sense whatsoever to start at this stage, a week after a new Conservative leader, the process of a Liberal Democrat leadership election. People would have thought that was crazy.
Behind this famous facade, MPs trooped in and out of Charles Kennedy's office. Many said stay, others go. Some of his front bench team planned, but never sent, a joint letter calling on him to resign.
There is a legitimate question at the present time as to whether Charles Kennedy is providing the kind of frontline leadership that the party needs in the present part of the political cycle where the Conservative Party has a new, dynamic, energetic young leader.
A question asked most damagingly by Charles Kennedy's own deputy, Min Campbell.
Your deputy, Min Campbell, didn't back you when he spoke to journalists leaving a meeting in this room. Can he stay your deputy?
The position within the parliamentary party is that we have elected positions of various posts, and those are at the disposal of the MPs. The MPs have spoken with a very... The MPs spoke with a very united, collective voice.
Did your deputy give you his backing when he spoke to you?
They will take their decisions the next time any set of elections for the various elected posts in the party came round.
John, this is politics at its most brutal, isn't it? Do you think Mr Kennedy is going to survive this attempted coup?
No, I don't, and I think it was written all over his face there. I mean, he looks so uncomfortable and so unable to defend himself. I mean, I do feel for the guy. I mean, he looks like a combination of Michael Foot and Neil Kinnock, blathering on, trying to explain why their position isn't being undermined.
He wouldn't look Nick Robinson in the eye, would he?
I just thought, you know, that is a man who looks cornered. I mean, until I'd seen that actual footage, I was a bit more optimistic about his survival chances. But actually, that was a terrible performance.
So how long do you think he's got?
Well, it's up to the parliamentary party, because I mean there is actually no provision in the Liberal Democrat rules for challenging an incumbent leader. I mean, they have an election once every parliament, and they've already had that immediately after the election. Charles Kennedy took the precaution of ensuring that he was elected unopposed. So the only way of getting rid of him is to have a vote of confidence of the parliamentary party. which is a sort of a rough and ready way of just cutting short through all the sort of bureaucratic procedures.
So, Anne, do you think he's going to survive this?
No, I agree with John, actually. I mean, there's been a lot of talk amongst the younger MPs, who've just the new intake of Liberal Democrats, who actually do want him to stay, but they want to see a tougher line, really want to like grasp the metal, put his foot down and say, look, I'm the leader. He looked so weak in that interview there, and that's not what they want. I think they're slightly worried because, you know, Cameron's there, Lord Carlisle was saying that just there. Cameron's here, he's dynamic, he's actually making strides, he's getting on the front pages, and in fact, he's possibly stealing some of their clothes with all this talk of, you know, we're going to sort out the environment and so on. So I think they want somebody who's really going to grab the agenda because they don't want to slip back from their gains which they had in the general election.
George, who's behind this?
Well, it's mainly the front benchers, people like Ming Campbell, people like Mark Oaten, Simon Hughes. I mean, they feel the party has just been drifting since the general election. They got their best results since the 1920s, over 60 MPs, but nothing has happened, and they now see, you know, Gordon Brown likely to be leading the Labour Party within 12 months, 18 months' time. David Cameron made a stunning start as Conservative Party leader. But I think what happened this week was they came to the point where they almost had a sort of bloody coup, a bit like the way Margaret Thatcher was deposed back in 1990. They pulled back from that. Charles Kennedy is still in denial. I don't think he accepts what's going on. But I stood outside that meeting at Westminster where he met his parliamentary party. It went on for 90 minutes, and the grim faces when it came out, I thought, said everything. I think Charles Kennedy has got to go, but he's got to be brought to the point where he himself accepts it, a bit like Ian Duncan Smith was with the Tory party.
Yeah, it's more like Ian Duncan Smith than it is Thatcher. I mean, this is a party having a collective nervous breakdown. I mean, the problem is that their problem is much greater than Charles Kennedy. I mean, Charles Kennedy is not perhaps the best leader, but then once you get onto the question of who is, it becomes clear.
So is that the only reason he's still there, because there isn't a natural successor?
Yes, I mean, one of the reasons why he has been a leader for so long and been relatively successful is that he hasn't actually faced the party with any hard choices. I mean, the point is, if you had a more active leader, he or she would have to take positions on everything. And then, you know, when you had Paddy Ashdown there, he took all sorts of positions that actually the modern Liberal Democratic Party wouldn't like. He would have supported the Iraq War, for instance, and that was their big card at the last election.
So, Anne, where are things lining up behind the scenes? Who's supporting who, other than Charles Kennedy?
It's
where's
really,
everyone?
really hard to tell because there's been a lot of behind the scenes kind of whispering and sort of backbiting and so on. I mean, the interesting thing about the Liberal Democrats is there's no obvious successor, and there seems to be a gap. There's a lot of quite talented and quite thrusting new, quite young MPs who maybe aren't quite old enough or experienced enough to actually take over the reins. Mind you, look at David Cameron.
Who are the names? Who?
Maybe somebody like Sarah Tether, you know, Nick Clegg's name often comes up. There are a lot of other ones who maybe not as well known as them, who would maybe like to, you know, get in there as well, but not yet.
But as John says, they've got to decide, what are they? Now, are they going to be a sort of softer version of the Conservative Party, as people like Mark Oaten and the people who wrote the Orange Book want? I mean, they want to get much closer to the Conservatives, possibly even form a coalition with the Conservatives. Or, as Simon Hughes said, do they want to be a left-wing radical alternative to the Labour Party?
Do you think they know?
They don't know, and you get statements where some want to sort of don't want to put up income tax, others want to put up income tax, others want to sort of break up the NHS, others don't. They don't know, and they're this coalition. Charles Kennedy has managed to keep it together, as John says, by not taking the tough decisions, by being quite passive. But it's now all breaking out, and that's what this leadership election, which I think will come next year, will decide what direction they're going to go.
And that presumably is because they have to have a chance to have a new leader in place ahead of any general election.
Yes, but it's not just, I mean, they can't sit around and wait. Politics suddenly is in ferment. It's changing, and we could be going back to two-party politics, and that's the real squeeze which the Liberal Democrats fear.
So, John, do you think this is their best opportunity, and if they mess this up, they could just melt away?
No, I think the last election was their best opportunity for some time, and I actually think there's a lot of wishful thinking about the results of the last election. I mean, they did very well, mainly because they got an extra 4-5% of the vote, which was an Iraq protest vote, and they won't have that next time. And so and what's more, they're going to be squeezed on the other side because, of course, Cameron will take away some of the Green Tory, soft Tory vote. And so actually I can see the Liberal Democrats imploding. I mean,
so Kennedy not around for the next election?
Probably not, no.
Okay,
Definitely
well,
not.
from one rebellion to another, albeit slightly smaller, because this week 58 Labour MPs, including former ministers, put forward an alternative to the government's plans to make schools more independent. They want tougher rules to prevent selection by ability and no reduction in the power of local education authorities. The Prime Minister says he's determined to press ahead. So, is there any chance of a compromise, or will Mr Blair have to rely on the Tories to save his reforms?
Musical harmony at a brand new school in one of London's poorest boroughs, a far cry from the political disharmony at Westminster. This privately sponsored academy enjoys freedoms Tony Blair wants to extend to all schools: financial autonomy, control over its curriculum and independence from the local council. But 58 Labour MPs, including 5 former ministers, say there must be safeguards. They want councils to have powers to stop the best schools picking and choosing pupils at the expense of their neighbours.
All it could do is actually give one school independence at the risk and the consequence of making it almost impossible for a neighbouring school to raise standards.
In short, Mr Blair's been told by Labour MPs to change tack or risk defeat, the stark dilemma to back down or to harness the support of the enemy to face down his Labour critics.
There is a difference between his view and the view of his backbenchers. So he faces a choice. With our support, he can have the reforms that our schools need, or he can give in to the Labour Party. Which is it to be? White paper or white flag?
He spent hours practicing that one, I think. There is a difference with those of the backbenchers on my side that have published their proposals today. That is absolutely true. But the point is there is also a difference with the Conservative Party. And let's just be quite clear what that difference is. He wants to return to academic selection.
And how much trouble is Tony Blair in over the education white paper?
He is going to have to give a little bit on what he's planning. I mean, I do understand from conversations I've had with backbenchers that he may be willing to give on the admissions policies. It's been something which has been worrying a lot of backbenchers. They're concerned that schools will be able to select and maybe keep sort of maybe less academically gifted pupils or maybe poorer pupils even out of schools. So I do understand that he is actually willing to give a little bit on that, and in that case they would be willing possibly to support him when it actually comes round to bringing the bill next year.
George, is this a new softer Tony Blair we're seeing then? He wasn't willing to give in on the terrorism, so why is he suddenly being slightly more concessionary over this?
Well, of course, he doesn't want to fall into the trap which David Cameron is trying to dig for him, of saying, you know, you can have your bill, you can have a much tougher policy on school admissions, you can get rid of local education authorities. I mean, this is largely an English education issue, but get rid of the education authorities, give them these much stronger freedoms. But of course, you will have to do that with Conservative votes. Now, Tony Blair knows the position that he is in. That would be effectively political suicide. It would split the Labour Party down the middle, and those people who've published the alternative white paper, they're not the usual suspects of the 20 or 30 rebels, many of whom defied him over the terror laws. They're serious, mainstream backbenchers.
Yeah, but
some of them are
they've all voted against the government before. I mean, there's only 5 of them who are actually you know, first time rebels on this, and and we haven't even had a vote on it yet, so we don't know that they're going to vote against.
But what kind of signal does it send?
Actually,
an alternative white paper, that's not that common, is it?
No, I agree. I mean, I was seeking to diminish the size of the rebellion there. Actually, it's worse than, and I think it's worse than that. In that the usual suspects, the 20 really hard left Labour MPs aren't on the list. I mean, they didn't sign up for this alternative white paper because it's too soft for them. You know, so you've actually got about 80, 90 Labour MPs who aren't for it. But I mean, the important point is that the Conservatives aren't going to bring Blair down on this one. I mean, they're not going to vote against the government, and therefore, you know, I mean, it's dangerous territory because Blair knows he can't lose it, and he doesn't want to split his party, as George was saying.
Then if he has 80 MPs voting against him. I mean, what
so
signal
what?
that says about his own
Well,
authority.
when you saw what
his
he was
own
doing there, George,
ability.
he's triangulating, isn't he? He's triangulating himself between Cameron on the one side and the Labour rebels on the other side, and he'll go straight down the middle, and everybody will be very happy. I mean, the people out there
I don't think
will support him.
But you're talking about Labour rebels. There are some people who are actually planning not to vote for these education reforms who have never actually ever voted against the government. It's not the, you know, there's a hardcore. No, not just the people who've actually supported the white paper, other backbenchers, you know, who haven't rebelled before, and they've actually made it clear that they won't vote for the education reforms as they stand right now.
It's a totemic issue for him.
Yeah, I think it is.
Education,
And I think,
it goes to Labour's soul. I mean, you remember
But
all
what
the
you say-
fuss about Harriet Harman sending her children to a selective school. I mean, it really does go to the heart of the Labour
you know,
Party.
and education, which he said at the very, very, very beginning. And, you know, he does want to get his reforms through. And, you know, I know that he has said to, there's a hardcore of around maybe sort of 40 or 50 Labour MPs who do want him out. And he has actually said, just let me get my education, my health through, and I'll go whenever you're ready.
He is going to get them through. The question is how. I mean, the
So
question is
will
how
he-
much of a split?
Everything,
How much of a split? How many
Would
of them in
he
the end
prefer
on the Labour
would he
side?
prefer to dilute his reforms and win the support and get it through with the support of his own backbenchers, or would he prefer to go for the radical reforms and rely on the Tory support? If it was a choice.
He will dilute his reforms. I mean, there are signals.
Very
as Anne
slightly.
said.
Very slightly. He'll tighten up on
As
admissions.
you saw the fact that they withdrew plans for a new code of conduct on admissions, which is now likely to be put in the education bill when it comes, so that gets statutory backing. So he's going to make concessions to them. The key question is whether they will go far enough. And of course, you're now getting Labour MPs in a more rebellious mode. They may rebel also over health changes.
And we had the indication earlier from your paper, earlier that he may not push through his welfare reforms because he hasn't got the muscle to fight.
Of incapacity.
Yeah, but he hasn't. Sorry, Jenny. He hasn't pushed through the welfare reforms for the past 8 years. So I mean, he hasn't been able to do anything about incapacity benefit for 8 years. So the fact that he can't do it now is not necessarily an indication that he's weakening.
And Mr Cameron's tactic of trying to drive a wedge through the party, do you think, is there any danger that by doing that he could in fact drive a wedge through his own party? Is there any danger that if he votes with the government and doesn't use it as an opportunity to bring them down, that his own party will split?
Well, David Cameron has got a group of usual suspects, MPs like Eric Forth, who don't like what he is doing. But at the moment, Cameron has, I think, made such an effective start. He's got an agreement, I think, and a mandate, the overwhelming leadership election that he got. He said this is what he is going to do. I think he is all right for that for the first year or so. And if he is ahead in the polls and it looks as if he's a winner, then I think the malcontents will have to go along with it. But it is a strategy which, as you say, could expose the divisions on his own side.
OK, well, talking of the Tories, David Cameron has announced plans to increase the number of women Tory MPs. It's part of his strategy to change the face of his party and broaden its appeal to voters. But will it work?
Out with the old, in with the new. David Cameron's telling the Tories it's time to shed their white, male, middle-class image. Here in Leeds, among people he thinks should reflect the modern Tory party, women, the ethnic minorities and the disabled.
The conversation that we must have in the Conservative Party must reflect the conversation that we need to have with the whole of the country. And the sound of modern Britain is a complex harmony and not a male voice choir.
Candidates will now come from a balanced list of men and women. If local parties don't comply, says Mr Cameron, they'll be made to. For newly elected women MPs like Justine Greening in Putney, it's a welcome change. She says involving local supporters will make for better candidates.
It's just about making sure that the quality is as good as possible, but also making sure that there's some diversity of candidates there, and that those final three say that the public at large in the local area have to pick are actually a good balance.
After May's election, Michael Howard had 54 new MPs, but there were only 6 women. Traditionalists say interference by central office isn't the answer.
I think it is nonsense to say, here is a list of the most meritorious people, but oh, by the way, we know in advance that 50% of them will be women and 50% will be men.
George, these plans to introduce more women MPs, does it have teeth? Is it going to work?
Well, it certainly has teeth. It doesn't go as far as Labour's plans. I mean, Labour had all women shortlists, and that resulted in the Blair Babes in 1997. Labour got 100 women MPs. Now, the Tories aren't going that far, but they're going to have this A list, a priority list of candidates, of which half will be women, and that the target seats, the winnable seats, which are selecting candidates, will have to choose from that list. I think in a way the election of David Cameron, the acceptance of this young, untested but sort of fresh-faced new leader, I think showed that the Tory party activists themselves want to change. I think they're probably willing to give this a go. They know, as David Cameron...
They were a little bit
the
desperate,
Labour Party
weren't
wanted
they?
to have women MPs, and they just wouldn't do it when it came to the crunch until they were forced to. So it doesn't matter how well-meaning all these people are.
Things have moved on. That was 10, 12 years ago. I do think attitudes have changed in the Conservative Party. I think the election of David Cameron has shown that. And as he said, 9 out of 10 Conservative MPs are white, middle-aged men. The Tory Party know, and I think what we've seen actually over the last few weeks is the Tory Party have got hungry again. They want to win an election.
they'll do
they
what it
want to win
takes.
power, and I think they'll do what it takes.
And do you have any sense among the wider party, among the constituencies, how they feel about women MPs or women candidates?
Well, I think you may have some trouble, with them imposing... I know it's not all women shortlists, but there will be some trouble, I expect, when it comes to selection and so on. But again, I do agree with George. I think they are desperate to get back in power and they'll do anything that it takes. But I think it just kind of shows some sort of form of desperation. I mean, the fact that they actually chose such a new, young, untested leader, as George said, just tells you everything. I mean, they thought, well, we may as well just take a chance. We've got nothing better. So let's just throw it right out there. Look what's happened for the last sort of 7 or 8 years.
Is this the right issue for Mr Cameron to be starting on? I mean, he has huge political capital at the moment. He's just got this mandate. Why is he picking women MPs to run with first of all?
Well, because one of the things which has damaged the Tory party and damaged the Conservative brand is that they look out of touch with the country. I mean, they keep on going into elections and getting 30%, 33% of the votes. I mean, people have switched off to them. Women, particularly at the last election, switched off to them. And women used to vote quite heavily in favour of the Conservative Party. So it is a key central issue, and it's a key issue. He hasn't quite got clause 4, which was, Tony Blair abolishing the commitment to nationalisation, but he wants something which stamps his
I agree that's why he's doing it, but it's purely symbolic because it won't work. And so,
Is this another case of style over substance?
I think so, because I think this is just giving him something to talk about for the first few weeks, and it makes the right sort of impression, and everybody sort of nods and says yes, we must have more women MPs. But then everybody said that in the Labour Party. They said, oh yes, we must have more women MPs, and then when it got to the crunch of the selections, they didn't go for the women. It was only if there was no choice, if there were only women on the shortlist, that you actually got the breakthrough.
Do you think they'll be forced at some point to go further and introduce all women shortlists?
Well, if they're serious about it, yes. But I suspect they're not.
I can't see that happening.
There is a very respectable, principled objection to all women shortlists, which is that discrimination against men is actually not the right answer to discrimination against women.
And what about this? He said he had a couple of PMQs now. He's doing very well in the polls. It's obviously some kind of honeymoon period. Do you think it'll last?
I don't think so. In fact, I think it's already over. I was discussing, how when he'd actually do something wrong at PMQs, I thought he was dreadful. There's the second PMQs that he did. His opening gambit was so poor, and I think that...
What do his MPs think? Have you been talking to them?
Well, the MPs weren't that impressed. Not as impressed as the first time he did PMQs. I just don't think he was as impressive as he was the very, very first week. I think he bombed. He did recover as he went on, but I don't think he was very good at all. And I think, some people have got slightly hysterical about it, and they've all kind of fallen in love with David Cameron, and they're being swept along, I wouldn't suggest that George...
I think it's a bit harsh.
I think we're coming down to earth a bit. He's got an enormously steep learning curve, and I think that second PM's question time showed that he is not as quick at thinking on his feet. He's got far more to do to learn those sort of parliamentary occasions, but I think it's only about the 7th time he's actually spoken from the dispatch box.
But has the shine come off him for his own party yet?
I don't think it has. The Telegraph's got a poll this week, which shows that actually David Cameron is now equally as popular, level pegging with Tony Blair, and the Tories are ahead. Now, Michael Howard went ahead of Tony Blair when he became leader a couple of years ago, and then that lead fell back and Labour regained it. But I just think that the political mood, the political weather is changing. There's an opening for David Cameron if he can take it.
We'll see how it develops. Thank you. Well, that's it for this week. My thanks to Anne Alexander, George Jones and John Rentoul. Next week, James Landale will be casting a seasonal eye over the stars and turkeys of the past political year. But for now, goodbye.